The CEO is everyone's boss, and the boss's boss is the market.
What you see at the top is just a fraction of everything beneath.
You have to get closer to reality.
Some are like the best people to hire, former special forces. They're amazing because their closeness to reality and the feedback.
If you're in an environment that doesn't optimize for like real feedback, you're stuck in this stagnant thing. But luckily, you have access to the internet and you can write. And then you get to move on to making the next thing basically for yourself, but informed by the feedback you're getting from what you're putting out onto the internet. Not having reality as your boss, it's really hard to get that feedback.
If your job is asset management in the market, buying and selling stocks, reality pounds you in the face every day.
If you're in a room with someone, they almost can't ignore you, even if you're not making that much sense. But if you're not making sense on the internet, you're just dead on arrival.
Well, hello everyone, it's Jim O'Shaughnessy with yet another Infinite Loops, and we have another return guest. I loved him so much the first time, and he has been tearing it up since he was last on. Please welcome back Jack Butcher, the founder of Visualize Value, a network of mentors with $1 million a year in product business and a media platform with an audience greater than 500,000. Man, I got to take some tips from you because I think I don't even think I'm at 1,000 true fans yet, man. My first question before we get into all the cool stuff you've done since we last chatted was I saw in our team's notes that you really did a big direction change after reading Naval's How to Get Rich thread on Twitter. Can you tell us about that?
Sure. So my background is I studied graphic design at university in the UK and then just went basically straight into the agency business. So I had some work experience when I was 16 in a design agency, which is what led me to eventually want to pursue design professionally as an adult. And got into the agency world, and it took me probably almost 10 years of changing jobs, thinking that the different agency environment was the fix to my frustration, but ultimately had like a fundamental disagreement with the way those businesses functioned. The incentives that were almost diametrically opposed from client side, and at least on the creative side of the agency, you're kind of fighting against this very strange incentive model. And in reading Naval's stuff initially, that really reframed a lot of my understanding of how to present yourself and how to think about your relationship with the world. So the agency model really is like this: you get invited to participate in something, and then you kind of like scrap and fight to beat out other people that have been invited to pitch work for free, and then try and basically eke out the engagement as long as possible because you're billing time and materials, versus the ideas that were presented in that thread, which were really about this concept of judgment and leverage. So if you're able to articulate what you do really well, you can create, basically a magnetic force that brings people who want to work with you to your door, as opposed to the complete opposite model where you're chasing people and then in this really interesting, conflicting relationship with them from that point forward. So that's where basically the genesis of Visualize Value came from, is if I can articulate if I can make things that represent the type of things that I want to keep making in a very specific way, that in theory would become a way to attract the types of people that I want to work with. And theory turned out to be true after 6, 9, 12 months of repetition of just kind of pursuing that in public. And just completely reshaped the way I interacted with the world from that point forward. And it's taken there are a few iterations out from there where we are today, but that was the huge turning point in the way I thought about looking for opportunity in the world.
Fascinating. And it's a little bit, you could listen to what you just said and think, oh yeah, build a better mousetrap and the world will be a path to your door. And that isn't really it exactly. When I was listening, it's like you figured out a way to essentially align your incentives with your clients' incentives, which I think is brilliant and has proven incredibly beneficial and fruitful for you. How was it starting out? Did it was it hard?
Incredibly hard. So I use this, I've told this story a bunch of times now, but when I first started my own agency business, I was able to do it based on the relationships I already had from my old jobs, which I think is most people's ventures, at least in like service world or white collar business world, is like they have a connection somewhere and they're able to like get that jolt of energy to kickstart the business. So there was a client I was working for as a employee of another agency that wanted to run leaner, and I was able to basically build a little freelance business off of that. And I quickly learned that all of the infrastructure in that corporate environment, the salespeople, the client, the account managers, all of the things that were kind of orbiting me, there was a level of, I guess, arrogance and naivety that I'd built up in the fact that I thought that I was doing all of the work, right? I was the designer, so I'm like making the thing that gets shipped out of the door. But that's 2%, 5%, whatever it is, of the equation of answering all the phone calls that the client wants you to answer and taking people to dinner and doing all of these things that ultimately I wanted no part of. I just wanted to be in front of the computer making stuff. And initially that, I guess I just didn't understand that until I was out on my own and started to try and just put work out into the world. And I was like, a lot of agencies do this where you're working on a video one week, the next week you're working on a website, then you're working for an automotive brand, then a chocolate brand, then washing up liquid, and there's no like coherence to the stuff you're putting out. So I was just kind of posting work that there was no kind of thread through it or point of view of mine that was, in my mind, I map that back to this idea of equity that Naval talks about. That's not just, a signature on a term sheet or a cap table. It's really about this collective understanding in other people's minds of what you do, what you're capable of, what you stand for. And it wasn't until I really honed in and focused on a very specific, not only visual style, but kind of filter for the types of ideas that I would put through that filter, that I started to see a little bit of momentum happen. And before that, it's like my mom commenting on my Facebook posts, like, that looks great, Jack. And that was at least a year of just doing that into the void. And then completely separate, you maybe have someone from your old world that's like, hey, Jack, I've got this spare bit of work that I'm going to throw your way. I was getting no momentum from the internet until I really honed in on a specific set of constraints and tried to really challenge what it was that was what qualifies as something that I should be publishing, and what are the second and third order consequences of publishing that stuff. But until that point, it was extremely difficult. And another, I don't know if it's in that Naval thread or not, there's another statement that he made, said 99% of all effort is wasted. And that resonated so much with me from the agency background, where basically nothing you do sees the light of day. It's this like, I'm not trying to, everybody who's listening to this, I'm not like, I have no issue with that. It's just not for me. But this like the charade or the LARPing that goes on in those environments for months and years on end is just so frustrating when all you see in the final product is what was removed from, your intent, or what was like committed into something that doesn't represent the thing you wanted to do. So yeah, that was hard for that reason. And then starting out was hard for another reason. There's obviously always trade-off in however you choose to conduct yourself.
Yeah, a horse or a camel rather, is a horse designed by a committee, right?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely true.
So moving from like one to one, where you're basically selling your talents and time, to a more product based environment. Surely a lot of your clients would come to you and say, "You Jack, I love it, but," right? How do you handle that? How do you handle everyone that wants an exception, a tweak, a pivot, etc.?
So I went through that in stages, from the extremely hands-on. The stuff I was putting out really early on lent itself to people reaching out about doing pitch decks, or they have some complex idea or string of ideas that they want to simplify into 5 slides, 10 slides, whatever it may be. Use, some hero diagram for explaining to investors what they do, or training people internally. There was all these different interesting use cases for distilling ideas into visuals. So I would do that to begin with, where I would basically take the discipline, or the process of distilling an idea, and then do it in the style of the brand I was working with. That was like first iteration. So it's like visualize value, but your ideas and your brand, or the elements of your brand. So it's kind of this agency relationship in a way. Then I moved to, okay, we don't do any stylistic changes. You bring the ideas and they come out as you see, like the visualized value stuff. And then basically demand took over on the consulting side, where I was like, there's probably something here that can, take the form of a product. And the first thing I did was to try and build a curriculum around the process of visualizing value. So how do you take an idea, kind of separate it into its logical parts, and then ship it back out as a diagram that captures the essence of it, and then moved away from the service component entirely after doing that. There's been a few things over the last couple of years that I've like really wanted to get involved in, because I, beyond a purely commercial interest, is something that's like super fun to work on. But the amount of impact you can have by adding 2 new modules to a curriculum that 10,000 people are already a member of is so much more significant than booking another meeting with one client. So it turned into being completely focused on the product stuff, and then almost like a transition to a media company in that way. So you're just creating things on the front end that are increasing the reach of this thing, and then that creates all these opportunities to really just like make something and ship it and have people consume that thing, and then you get to move on to making the next thing basically for yourself, but informed by the feedback you're getting from what you're putting out onto the internet. So it's been an iterative journey from a very, very hands-on service-based thing to producing media and building products basically.
What surprised you the most in your journey thus far? And obviously you'll have more surprises, but like what are you, because it happens to me all the time, right? Like we'll be doing an investment, we'll be doing a new project or something, and like almost every time it's like, God damn, I would never have guessed that would have been the thing that everyone valued the most. How about you and your curriculum and what you're doing?
I think the like compounding network effect of people who have consumed the material is the most, like, the thing that you can't really understand until you see it in action, and it takes a long time to take hold. So just, I guess a good example of that is what I've been doing for the last 6 months has really I've seen so many people that joined or been a part of Visualize Value 2-3 years ago, that once there is a canvas or an opportunity to contribute to something, the almost like the shared comprehension of the type of material and the idea that all of the people in this digital gathering place have all consumed the same 500 images, and it's kind of this like filter for a worldview, a like mentality in many cases. Like these people who, for the most part, join this environment because they want to work independently as a creative on the internet, and like identifying those people and having them meet and work with one another has produced outcomes that I would never have been able to predict before. People getting together, building products, or having like successful careers as digital artists after understanding more intricately how the internet works, how you can build distribution, why you should simplify and communicate your ideas as best as you possibly can, and having this like small network of people that you trust to get feedback from as you do that has been a powerful tool for a lot of people along the process.
Yeah, it very much resonates with our thesis around O'Shaughnessy Ventures, right? We use terms like smart swarms over loose networks, but same idea, right? That the internet, we really need to recontextualize and think about the platforms that are available to us. We get. I mean, we're going to talk about semantics later on because you have a lot to say about that as well. But we get captured by our old models and our old language, and it sometimes prevents us from seeing, oh, wait a minute. Like I have this whole new platform, I have this whole new way of gaining leverage, and then we still do it the old madmen way, so to speak, to be in your vernacular. Another thing you talk a lot about that I'm really interested in because I share your opinion is this idea that like it's all really the metaphor of an iceberg, right? What you see at the top is just a fraction of everything beneath, right? And one of the things that I find really fascinating about you is you seem very good at capturing on that top piece, right? A lot of what is below the surface. Like, what's your process? How do you do that? I mean, that's really a talent and a skill.
Thank you. First, I think maybe the story of how Visualize Value came to be can shed some light on that, I guess. Like the ideas that I put into practice, and as you rightfully credited at the beginning of the episode, the Naval isms that basically kicked off and inspired this amplification of these ideas that I was completely unaware of as a frustrated creative, in my mind, is almost like putting those things in practice, and when you get positive feedback from them, these things like compound on top of one another. It's a hard thing to describe, I think, but once you have belief in an idea from experience, not just from like reading that thing and kind of identifying with the truth of it tangentially somehow, where it's like, oh, that sounds like the opposite of what I've experienced, therefore it might be true, versus like I have now experienced this and I can, I guess, talk about it with far more conviction because I have evidence that I've gone through that feedback loop. And I think maybe that is symbolic of the top of the iceberg. It's like you can really get to more of the truth of something if you have those different layers or levels of real feedback against what it is you're trying to say. And I think the Navalisms come from, and this is I don't know, this is conjecture from me, come from watching 1,000 companies try and become something and 900 of them failing. As an investor or as somebody building a platform like AngelList that is capturing real-time feedback from like essentially these organisms going out into the world and trying to become self-sustaining things, and in many cases not doing that, in my mind, there's like a real incredible feedback loop happening there that spans so many different disciplines, businesses, types of people, countries, all sorts of different inputs, that if you can make a statement that kind of that remains true across all of your experience, that's what you're doing, or that's what I think comes out as looking like tip of the iceberg type thing, where you can, I always had this exercise where before I would send a tweet, I would kind of try and defend it from its worst critic. So like if I was trying to interpret this in the least generous way possible, what would I say? And then I'm not saying I get this right, but that was the like way in which I would edit something, is how could I write this to a point where I feel the most confident in defending it? I would just keep rewriting it until like the worst thing I could imagine somebody saying in response to it, I would have a response to. And I don't know, that's how, that seems to have been a reasonable like little mental framework for not getting dragged into silly discussions on Twitter, and like really thinking through, do I believe this? Is it responsible for me to say this? Can I back it up with any evidence that I might have or experience that I might have gone through?
That is a great way, because what you're really doing is you're steel manning your argument, whereas most people prefer to straw man their opponent's argument, and they end up often building a straw man of their own argument, so they don't even understand the most obvious problems with it, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
It leads very nicely into something that I really admire about you as well. You flip fear on its head. So many people are like, fear is what prevents them from like doing what you're doing, from starting a new company, from, trying a new idea out. And the other thing that you seem to intuitively understand, which is not that intuitive, which is like most things are complex adaptive systems. And if you're dealing with a complex adaptive system, all emergence comes from below, not from the above, right? And so what you were just saying about, your ability to take all of that feedback, did you like, was there a moment when you were just like, fuck it, I'm just not going to be afraid, I'm just going to do this, and I'm going to, as I said, flip fear on its head? Can you walk us through that process to help our listeners who, like, maybe there are a lot of other creatives right now, and they're like, God, I love his work, I love what he's doing, but I'm terrified to put my own stuff out there.
Yeah, I'm trying to think back to my transition, as I mentioned before, from like, it's funny, I also moved to the States when I was 21, right? So I'm almost in this, I'm also like running this weird experiment on myself by taking myself out of the environment where I had, the people I studied design with, for example. Like I lived with 8 of those guys at the end of my career when I was in the UK, and then you put yourself in a completely new environment and this is all me like in hindsight trying to analyze some of this stuff, where stakes feel lower almost when you completely change the environment you're in. So you're, everything is upside in many ways when you're like not trying to moderate your decisions against things that people expect you to do. Like you kind of hit this clean reset button or something. And I don't think that's always a physical change, but I always like, even earlier on in my life, I would have these like reactionary moments where I'm like, I don't like this. I'm going to go do something else, and I guess there's like a fundamental paradox there where there's some safety that comes from being in the same environment, but there's also this like anti-fragility that comes from just messing stuff up over and over and over again. Put yourself in a different place, do this, do that. Like you're maybe capping your upside in the short term by moving around quickly. And I would get that a lot at the start of my career where people are like, you've been here for 6 months, like you should give it more time and see and I'm like, I know that this is not what I want to be doing. So if you're telling me that I could be doing the same thing, be getting paid twice as much, I'm not interested in that. So I'm not really sure what the argument is from that side. So I think throwing yourself into these environments, after 2 or 3 of them, you're like, okay, worst case scenario, I get a little more experience. And as a designer specifically, you're building a portfolio of work. And this is something that I'm like, have realized retroactively is after going through all these interviews at these design firms, no one really asked me about what school I went to. They asked me where I worked before, but all they cared about was what I'd made. And they would make hiring decisions for the most part, at least early in my career, based on purely on my ability to produce the thing that I said that I could produce. And I think that is different, and it's an incredible advantage that I even realized a couple years into my career. I don't even need to be given a brief to make my portfolio better. I could just go and redesign something that I don't think doesn't work or that I wished I could work on. And I actually have to give a shout out to an agency that was, I think they're still around. It's called Fantasy Interactive. And they used to do these like hypothetical design exercises where they were UI, UX agency predominantly. And they would say, what does the future of air travel look like? This is us imagining how we would redesign, let's say AmericanAirlines.com and their app without their permission, without 1,000 stakeholders in the way of us and the end goal. We're just going to do it, create this sexy highlight reel of how it works. And then my assumption is they were flooded with inbounds from airlines that want to be the first to own that concept or pay for the development of that thing. And that was I guess that idea was implanted in my mind way before the Naval stuff even, where if you have the ability to create something that represents what you think or what you would do if given permission, you have such a massive advantage, and you aren't reliant on the position you're in at that moment in time necessarily. You have this ability to like build this compounding proof of work that you can take into a different context or a different environment, or, worst case scenario, you can work at the lower end of that industry if something goes wrong in your career. And I was in New York at the time where, you could, a freelance graphic design work will keep you alive, worst case scenario. There's obviously so much opportunity on the upside, but yeah, I worked in a Honda factory before I studied graphic design in the Swindon in the UK. So all of this stuff was like gravy to me early in my career. I was like, I can't believe I'm getting paid to, come up with a skateboarding brand or to shoot a Ferrari commercial I was like, this is insane. So that part of that was like, I don't know, I think that also gives you this interesting perspective to operate from, where you're just continually surprised by what you're getting away with being able to do for work.
I love that idea. And, you just touched on so many things that I'd like to even go further on. The first is I had a friend pre-internet who made a fortune doing exactly what you described that agency did. He would get forms and things in the old snail mail. There was no internet, right? And what he would do is whenever he found something that confounded him, he would redesign the entire thing, and then he would send it to the company. And literally, he got ridiculously rich doing this because all the companies were like, holy shit, that's so much better. That's like 10x better than what we had. And they ended up buying it from him and hiring him. So I love that. The other thing, I have a lot of friends from the UK, and I'm fascinated by this idea that it keeps coming back to me as I talk to them, especially those who live here in the United States. So, for example, our interior designer that we use is a working class Brit from the north of Britain. And she said something really that kind of shocked me when she first said it to me. We were out and she'd done some really great work for us. And I'm like, wow, I mean, you're amazing. You're everything. And like, why didn't you do this like when you were in the UK? And she looked at me and she goes, you would have never hired me in the UK. And I went, what? And she goes, no. She goes, the UK says we don't have a class system anymore. We still have a class system. And somebody like you would never hire somebody like me. And I literally like called bullshit on her. I'm like, God, I can't believe that. And she goes, listen, she goes, before I moved to America, I'll just be really honest with you. I hated Americans. I thought they were like,
yeah.
and then she said, then I moved here and she was like, holy shit, I love Americans.
Oh, yeah.
Is that something? I mean, like, is that a real thing?
It's interesting. Like I've spent my entire adult life in the States too. So my points of comparison are incredibly, I guess they're so far in my distant memory, but there's definitely like massive cultural differences between the States and the UK in my mind. And again, I'm speaking from very, very limited experience, but in the design industry, for example, like the amount of responsibility that was entrusted to me when I got to New York versus the guys that I graduated with that were literally making tea in their agency businesses. And it was a weird, this is a bit of a personal realization or a personal experience I had when I was in the pub watching the World Cup. This is probably 3 years ago or something. And it was an English pub in an American city full of Brits. And the national anthem comes on. You know the British national anthem. God save the Queen at the time, God save the King now. And it was a really interesting moment for me. I was listening to that. Normally I'd be belting that out, like screaming it out. That was my youth. And I was like, this is like a fascinating, I mean, there has to be some massive sociological insight in this idea of being the subject of a royal family that, in my mind, has to trickle into culture in some way, and maybe is responsible for a lot of the, a lot of the way people behave subconsciously. Even like there is this, like your society is fundamentally structured around this idea of inherited importance. You know, like you are important because you come from bloodline X. And that is obviously true across every, that's true in the States in certain families, but it isn't the identity of the nation necessarily. So that is something that I've been thinking about ever since I had that experience. And there's so much about British culture that I love and miss. And like the self-deprecation of it is like what makes it almost like, the dry humor of the UK, there's a lot of crabs in a bucket, like almost part of the fabric of society. There was a guy who owned a bunch of karate schools where I grew up, and he came to speak at our school, and he drove a red convertible Ferrari, parked it outside the front of the school. And not a great reaction from the kids that went to that school, which I don't know if that'd be different in a different part of the UK you grow up in. And I don't know how much of a myth this is about the States either, but there is definitely a different, in many cases, there's just this different attitude towards building wealth. I think it can be frowned upon, or it can be dismissed because of, maybe it has something to do with the way in which wealth has been distributed in societies like that. And I have, a very specific experience with this idea of just coming somewhere, starting from scratch, basically, and pursuing my interest, trying to build stuff, and it's, happened to work in some instances, which has really changed my mentality around the possibility of that. I didn't grow up around, like, this is maybe it's a strange thing to say, but I didn't even understand the concept of an entrepreneur until I moved to the States. Like, I didn't even know that a person came up with an idea and started a company. Just like, and that sounds so ridiculous to say that when I'm like growing up. Both my parents are in the military. And I was around it. I think, where I grew up, there's a lot of people had, like, tradespeople would start businesses and, build incredible lives around these small businesses, but it just wasn't, I never really like thought about it or dug into it to the point where I was like, wow, somebody had an idea one day and they started this thing and now it's X. One of the first companies I worked for in the States was a massive digital consulting agency. And it was, I think, 15,000 people by the time I joined. And they would do like an onboarding thing. So you go to this week-long onboarding, and I was probably 24 at the time, and they would talk about, this is a publicly traded company. So they're talking about the market. They're talking about, our performance is contingent upon, or our performance is reflected in the price of this, blah, blah, blah. Completely over my head. No idea why they were telling me this, right? And then when I was late into my agency career, I was like super jaded, like, oh, all this work we're doing is not getting, not getting through to the client, blah, blah, blah. Then 2 years later, I start my own business. I'm like, man, I was so out of line for criticizing that. Like, how incredibly difficult is it to build a business of that scale, keep that many people employed? It's just an appreciation I don't think you have until you have exposure to that, either directly or through somebody really close to you that is kind of going through the process of trying to build something from essentially nothing, like create this thing that people believe in and contribute to. And unless you have great examples of that in your life, I think it's really difficult to start something up yourself.
Yeah, and I remember the first company that I founded. I remember the moment when I like woke up in a cold sweat, and I looked at my wife and I said, "Fuck, I am responsible for so many people's homes, their kids' educations, all of that." And like, it was this, originally at least, it was this huge weight. It was kind of like, oh my God, I better really do this well.
Yeah.
Because, if I don't, lots of people are going to suffer, not just me. And then the other thing is, I was listening to you, there's a book. The book itself isn't great, to be honest, but its thesis is really interesting. It's called The Hypomanic Edge: Why America is Built Differently Than Other Countries. And essentially the author's thesis is, listen, man, we are a nation of people who left their home country. They left their kith and kin. They left everything they knew, many with nothing, right? Got on a ship, came to a new country. That type of profile, that type of genetic innate profile might be different than the people stuck around, right? And so I find that interesting, and it's this kind of frontier mentality which you definitely see in America, even today, right? Now, it was much more pronounced earlier in America, but it leads to one of my kind of little hobby horses that I'm always on, which is we despite all of our problems, we still are the place most creatives, producers, entrepreneurs want to live and work. And my answer is let them come.
100%. Yeah.
Because like, if we can still be that draw, that is an asymmetric advantage over like virtually everywhere else. But you also bring up something that, as I just mentioned a second ago, really resonates with me. Running a business requires that you assume complete and utterly full responsibility for what the outcomes are. And, it's like Harry S. Truman, the buck stops with me.
Yeah.
Like, tell me a little bit about how that kind of dawned on you. I told you about waking up in a cold sweat myself. Was there a moment, or was that something that just kind of slowly became really apparent to you?
There's almost an inverse of that moment I had with my wife one day. We were living in Brooklyn, and this was in the like hodgepodge agency days. I had a reasonable sized corporate client, but I was just like totally burned out. I was not enjoying the work I was doing. I was just like kind of all of the downside of being responsible for everything with none of the upside, just like completely, just shell of a human being. She's like, you know what? Maybe we're not cut out for this. Maybe we're not entrepreneurs. Maybe this is not the right decision. And, whether it was, I don't know, there was just some response in me where I was like, you know what? I have enough evidence at this point that I don't want to go back to work and do this just basically in a different setting. So I need to figure this out. And that was when I read this article that I can't even find anymore. It was on Medium, and it was referencing the film In Time. Have you seen that film?
Yes, good film. Timberlake? Yeah.
And that I think led me down, or primed me for the Navals of the world and the people who were thinking at a level of abstraction higher than punch the clock, do the work, get paid, repeat. And reading that, I was like, there's something fundamental about this that resonates with me, but I don't get it. Like, how would I do this with my skill set? I am a designer that people pay to make the thing they want to make. And it took so long to break through that mentality. It's really not something you read and you figure it out. Like, you don't just go, oh, okay, then I'll just start doing that then. Like, that's not how it works, obviously. Like, all of this is a product of, this has been said many different ways, but it's like your decisions from 5 years ago, 3 years ago, 2 years ago are why you're doing or experiencing what you're experiencing today, not yesterday, not a week ago, whatever else. So these things take time to take effect, or if you're truly acting upon these ideas in the right way, you're not going to get feedback on day one that it works. So you do have to rely on your instinct that there's some truth in it when you start, because you are giving up. Like, I was giving up really, really good contracts with these brands. Like, I could live a comfortable life. Like, they would send me work, as much work as I could handle, basically. And there was no real end in sight to that. It was just, you feel like you're making zero progress. Like, a lot of this stuff is even under NDA, so I can't even publish it. I'm just like doing the work, delivering the work, getting more work, delivering the work. And understanding the opportunity that existed on the internet and Twitter specifically, that was a huge turning point too. Making the leap from my mum commenting on all my photos on Facebook to understanding how an open network like Twitter functions was a huge leap. I forgot the question, but that's another ramble on the power of the internet, I guess.
Yeah, no, it was an excellent ramble. And the thing I would highlight is something you said, about decisions. There's a good quote that goes along the lines of, you make your decisions and then your decisions make you.
Yeah, very good.
So being aware of that and cognizant of it, but also being aware that external validation is maybe not as useful as internal validation. I know you agree with me because I've been reading your stuff, but expound on that a little bit too, because I really believe that a lot of people don't get that.
Yeah, I think that is well contextualized by this idea of the day you plant the seed is not the day you eat the fruit. I don't know who to attribute that to, but that's like, these are biological, natural processes that you can't get away from. Like, these abstract things, you read them like, that's corny, it doesn't make sense, it's cringe. And then it's funny, all of these quotes, some of them that I've now worked with and made stuff to represent, if you'd have showed them to me when I was like 21, I'd be like, yeah, I would really dismiss that stuff with vigor. Let's just say that. But these things are cliches for a reason, because they're so broadly applicable, right? It's like so many people have seen the truth in them and kept them alive, because there's a fundamental mapping to the truth of a human experience that keeps this like little phrase on the wall or in a trinket gift shop. And, there's also, people operating at the highest level in business, in sport, in, whatever discipline, science that you want to imagine, that continue to reference these quotes. And until I think you're experiencing some form of that feedback, you're very skeptical about that stuff, because it sounds like people are just reciting these like party lines. The process, I think, of doing it for the sake of doing it is also a hard thing to convince people of. And the sake of it is like, visualize value, for example. Like, I found this little set of constraints that even if nobody saw what I was doing, I was getting better as a designer. Like, I was solving these little puzzles and I just happened to be broadcasting them out. Like, I was scratching a little creative itch of my own and happened to just be able to send those out as these like network of signals that represent my puzzle solving ability, I guess. And then that compounds in so many different ways. It's like, I get a little bit better at doing that each time. And the collective understanding of my ability to do that grows, because someone's seen me do it 50 times, then 100 times, then 500 times. Somebody had an incredible definition of what a brand is, and I'll try and dig up the reference, but essentially it's this decentralized belief that exists in other people's minds of your capabilities. And that is just the most intangible thing you can imagine. It's like it's a reputation brand that could be used interchangeably there, right? It's like expecting somebody to trust you to do something important the first day you meet them, highly unlikely. And you do something 100 times in front of somebody, and don't ask them for anything, they'll likely, at a certain point, if they need the thing that you do, come to you and say, hey, I've noticed that you've been doing this for however many years, however many times. I need help with that specific thing. Trust is this intangible thing that requires almost like, just the demonstration of your ability without the weird incentive structure creates the most amount of trust and brand and goodwill. And people have written very eloquently on all of the above. But it's really not a difficult thing once you've found something that is intrinsically motivating or interesting to you. And this is that massive fundamental debate about don't follow your passion, follow your skill or something. I can't even remember. It's a very good, I think, controversial line. And my critique of a lot of that is there has to be some level of interest sustained for you to be great at something. And I don't know if anybody's come up with the perfect answer to this, because a lot of it also comes down to competition, right? It's like people love basketball. The amount of people that love basketball relative to the amount of talent needed to get paid to be a basketball player, is that delta is like the biggest thing you could possibly imagine, right? So it is about getting really creative, I think, with like the trade-offs there of what am I great at, but what also can I kind of manipulate that into something that would have value to others. And in my case, I'd already been in environments where I understand this concept of, if you can help somebody communicate more effectively, then they're going to be able to capture more value, and you are going to be able to ask them for a little fraction of that value. And I think that's true in most contexts, especially on the internet. So people do it in different ways, like building a YouTube channel, for example. The amount of time it takes to build a YouTube channel to, livable income stream is enormous. It takes an incredible amount of time. And yeah, it's actually inspiring me to write more about this. It's like that gap that you have to transition is almost, there's this massive trade-off happening between what you're good at and what you ultimately want to be doing. And you're kind of just pointing it a little bit more in that direction each time. Like I haven't heard that many stories of this like ultra pivot of a creative person, at least. It's like one day they're doing this and then they completely shift to a different field where they have no reputation and they're, living off it on day one. The transition between those two things is largely a painful process, it seems.
Yeah. And there's just so much that we could go down, so many rabbit holes on what you just said, because like the idea, all of the really super successful people that I've met in my life, for the most, let's not generalize and say all, many of the most successful people I have met in my life have found that intersection between what they're intrinsically interested in and good at, and practice, right? And put it out there. I love Teddy Roosevelt's In the Arena. Again, a little bit corny, right? But like really true, really, really true. And there's so many conflicting things, right? Because without practice, you're going to fail, right? That I think everyone would agree with that. But by the same token, if you repeatedly practice the same thing, getting it wrong, right, and you do that 20 or 30 times, have you had a new experience, or have you just repeated the same mistake? And I used to say to people on my team, I used to say, there's nothing wrong with screwing things up, but try make new mistakes, right? Try to, after you've screwed something up, learn from it, because I think mistakes are, that's the learning rich environment, right? That's how you learn. You learn by fucking shit up. But you've got to say, okay, let's try to make a new mistake. And, the line, when an engineer builds a bridge and it falls down, they learn from that. They put it in their body of engineering knowledge, and they don't build the bridge that way again. And so much of what you see with these like huge flameouts, right, is people who try something, either, quotidian or profound, and fail. And then they just keep trying to do it the same way again and are surprised when they fail. And it kind of gets into the idea that I wanted to talk about with you, because you really seem to be good at understanding that the power and importance of words, but also the limitation of language, of our human language, right? Wittgenstein said, the limits of my language are the limits of my world. and you get into sort of Korbitsky's, the map is not the territory, the menu is not the meal. And I just looking at your work, I see that you think, at least I see it this way. I see a lot of your work that seems to signal to me that you've thought about this really, really deeply. So share a bit of like how you go about thinking about that, how you go about kind of almost transcending the language which binds us, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I've had that experience in a lot of different contexts. A lot of what the inspiration for visualized value, or the conviction in what visualized value came out of the gates as, which is this translate something complicated and verbose into something succinct, comes from pitching ideas to rooms full of people as a designer or an art director, or in an agency context, where actually, as you were teeing up this question, this idea of not even necessarily finding the skill, but finding the feeling that the skill creates, the feedback loop that the skill fuels. And in my case, that was the aha moment that people have in a room when you explain something to them that they previously didn't understand, or you give them this new layer of context that gives them a more appreciation for the company they work at or the thing that they're building, and that is a really powerful thing to experience. That I got addicted to that feeling, basically. A good friend of mine, his name is Jonathan Wilson, he said, success is an addiction that society approves of.
I love that.
Which, like, if you're trying to solve problems or you're trying to make people see something more clearly, that to me is the, like, I have this mechanism for doing that, but there are many other ways that somebody could do that. And then when you take that skill set over to the internet, all of your opportunity, I think this is true in the real world too, but you're literally shouting into the void on the internet if you don't have, like, if you're in a room with someone, they almost can't ignore you, even if you're not making that much sense. But if you're not making sense on the internet, you're just dead on arrival. It's like, the necessity to clearly communicate what you can do is like life and death as a commercial endeavor. And yeah, just getting that. The first part of that journey was Twitter, where there was a ability to see an idea that already resonated. So you're just building on top of stuff that has already been validated by the market in many ways, where a Navalism, let's say, has X number of people that have amplified it. I'm like, oh, maybe I could add a little bit of context to that idea, or share my additional interpretation of how I would visually contextualize that idea. And that started this feedback loop of sometimes the authors of those ideas would re-amplify what I'd made. So you have this like real, again, incentive alignment there, where the person who said the thing or articulated the thing is getting this piece of media that further amplifies their idea. They're amplifying it to people who are already interested in what they have to say and how they think, which puts those people in my orbit, and a couple of them might follow what I'm doing. And it's just this positive sum game all the way up, where you're introducing these ideas, giving something away, but also attributing the person who started the thing. And then I guess when you get to scale on the internet and you just start to think about things very differently, where if you're selling a product and you're able to pitch that product to 10,000 people, the subject line of the email could be the difference between one sale and 1,000 sales. It's really like, it really starkly illustrates how important it is to clearly communicate what you're trying to communicate. And that idea of the limits of the language are the limits of my world, I think you can take that in a really like conceptual way too, where what Visualize Value has been trying to do for years is to expand the minds of people who are trying to compete in this world. It's like the ideas that help me move from feeling trapped in an environment that I felt did not make full use of my abilities. And when I tried to offer more of my abilities, I was just hitting it up against a ceiling that the environment would not allow me to break through, to operating independently and trying to, you're almost doing a lot less, or you're spread across a lot less, but you're way more concentrated on the things that are the best use of your talent, skill, opinion, whatever synonym you want to use there. So yeah, I think about it in a couple of different ways, but it's crazy how a single sentence can completely change the trajectory of your life. You might write a tweet that resonates with somebody that, I'll give a concrete example of this. 2 people I collaborate with now on the work I'm doing came through Visualize Value and have been following it for 2 or 3 years. And it's almost like we speak a different language because of our shared context in that work. There are ideas that I've been kind of hammering over and over and over again. And anybody that wants to come and work on anything I'm doing is more than likely going to come through having seen all of that stuff. And your taste is aligned, your perspective on what should be built is aligned. And there's a really powerful and almost like indescribable quality to the relationships that you can build with people that you haven't. I've collaborated with people for years that I haven't met. I do a podcast with Trung, who I know you had on recently. I've never met him in person, ever. We've done 100+ episodes of a podcast. We've never met in person. And before that, we're, just going back and forth in Twitter DMs and probably following each other without interacting for, 100, 200, 300 pieces of content. You feel like you know somebody based on how they express themselves. So, and it's just totally obvious what Trung is good at, right? Like there's a million different ways for him to apply his talent, but he gets to pick exactly what he wants to do because he has demonstrated that skill for so long and built like an insurance policy for himself in doing that too.
Yeah, we are very simpatico. I would say that of all the people who work with me at O'Shaughnessy Ventures, I have maybe met a third of them in real life.
Incredible. Yeah.
And the head of my Infinite Media's vertical is Liberty on Twitter. And literally, I followed him for years and years on his newsletter and built up the conviction that, he is such a great curator and he is such a great thinker, and he weaves very disparate disciplines together kind of seamlessly.
Mm-hmm.
And part of the thesis for the new company has been that good taste, for lack of a better word, leads to good curation, leads to finding the people who love that kind of stuff, right? But I completely agree. The way we built O'Shaughnessy Ventures is very much like that, with like you and Trung. And the idea that you can find, if you're willing to open your own aperture, right? You can find incredibly talented people that you vibe with. And, it ultimately, yes, I want to meet everyone who works with me in real life. In fact, we're doing that this fall. But it certainly did not stop me from hiring a bunch of people, just on the proof of their work and the way that we synced up. But that also leads me to a question, like vision, right? Is that a skill, or is that something that is innate? Is that something that that like you can teach to somebody, or does the kernel have to be there?
I think it goes back to the exposure to certain people and certain things happen. Could basically speak to my experience, which I definitely attribute a lot of where I am now to definitely taking risks and being curious about how the world works. I think that is something that maybe one has a disposition for or not. But then the idea of being exposed to what is possible, in my mind, that's how your vision expands, is a function of how far you've seen other people go or how far you've seen other people push certain things. So I think there has to be that fundamental curiosity to expose yourself to those things, but even like the smallest amount of exposure introduces you to something else in many cases. Like the first guy I worked for in the States was a ex-JWT creative director, like worked Madison Avenue, like 80s, 90s advertising. And he started his own shop with 5 people in West Chelsea in a gallery building. And I guess I got exposure to like the nitty gritty, dirty business building from day one, which in my mind at the time, I'm not thinking, oh, I want to do this one day, but it still lodges this memory that that's possible. And I think the closer you can get to that, the more likely that stuff subconsciously influences you too. I think some people know that's what they want to do. I certainly didn't. When I came out of university, I'm like, if I could get paid to be a graphic designer, that will be incredible. Like if I like the part-time jobs and the stuff I did to support myself when I was a teenager, most of it was like, I'm going to go and study graphic design because I don't want to do this for a living. Like if I can make myself useful enough that I don't have to, I worked at like an industrial shredders for a little while. Honda, I mentioned. I had a ton of jobs that I was not looking forward to spending another 40 or 50 years doing. And I got lucky enough that my cousin was a graphic designer when I was younger. And I was like, that sounds better than going and, doing a week's work experience at the bus station, which is where the school would have placed me. So I got lucky on that front. And that's a whole nother thing about how uninspired a lot of the education system is for so many kids. Like if you don't get exposed to this stuff, you just don't know. And that's, I guess, the other promise of the internet is you can be exposed to that stuff regardless of your physical situation, which I think is one of the most positive arguments for the internet you can make, is the idea that you can get a job at O'Shaughnessy Ventures if you're a great writer. Doesn't matter where you live. But when I was coming up, when I was at university age, I think Twitter existed, but it was like people posting pictures of their lunch, right? Or it's really fascinating how we had the tool basically in the same form back then, but the way in which we used it was so much less sophisticated. And obviously that's only going to compound crazier and crazier and crazier. And the difference between being somewhere physically and not is really compressing, I guess. So I think, I imagine this is like, we share a lot of opinions on this, where vision is about what you're exposed to, and the internet, when used correctly or when pointed in the right direction, can really change your trajectory of your life, because you're exposed to people, you're exposed to ideas, you're exposed to experiences that you don't have directly, but you get so fascinated by that you find your way into it. The Naval thing is such a perfect example, because I was like mind blown by that stuff. 2 years later, I'm illustrating a book with Eric Jorgensen of Naval's ideas. Like if you'd have told me that the day I read that tweet, I'd be like, there's no way, But yeah, you can there's a great Steve Jobs quote, right? You can manipulate the world, you can shape the world, you can change things, you have agency. And I think a lot of it just comes down to being exposed to, there's a huge, amazing irony in that. Agency as a word, like this idea of being able to do whatever you want to do. And my entire background was agency businesses where I had no agency.
Eric is a friend, and the interconnectedness and synchronicities of the web just astound me, and always have. Like, I was an early adherent to. I was so fascinated by the internet, and another Brit friend of mine who we're also an investor in his company, Entrepreneur First, Matt Clifford, gave me the great term that the internet is the greatest variance amplification system that humans have ever invented.
Mm-hmm.
And I loved that description because, like, he's so right? It's like all of the things that we're doing, that you're doing, impossible without the internet, right? Just could not happen. And one of the things that I'm always pounding on is that theme, right? Like, you and I, if this is 1965, 1970, you and I will never meet each other unless it is absolutely accidental.
Mm-hmm.
And so one of the great things about the internet is what you've done, what we're trying to do, is it allows you to step into so many situations or learn about so many things that you simply would not have had an opportunity to do so, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I see this progressing, as you just mentioned, right? It's going to compound upon itself. And, I'm a big fan of Robert Wilson's work. He was 50 years ahead of his time. And he stole from Timothy Leary the idea that we all live in these reality tunnels that are different from other people's reality tunnels. But one of the things that I find fascinating and I'm very enthusiastic about is we are now developing methods and technology that will literally let us inhabit somebody else's reality tunnel. And
that's an insane concept. Yeah.
Isn't that unbelievable? Like,
yeah.
Imagine, like, let's say that you live in New York, right? And you're very liberal and X, Y, and Z, right? Imagine being able to wake up in, I don't know, Arkansas or Alabama and just experiencing what that is like. I personally think it will make people much more tolerant. If, and again, right, we were talking earlier about why are all these hackneyed phrases still around? They're still around because they make a lot of sense. And that's, you can walk a mile in somebody else's shoes. You have a lot more empathy for them. You might not agree, right? You probably won't. But if you have the opportunity to inhabit somebody else's reality, I just think that's very cool.
That'll be incredible.
Yeah, and I definitely see it coming with the tech that we are developing, and so I'm very excited. I mean, like, my version is like, I am so fucking lucky to be alive at this point in history.
Yeah, 100%.
Because, like, all of these things were impossible. Like, I'm 63, so 10-year-old Jim in 1970, like, none of zero of the, if I could time travel and tell 10-year-old Jim what he was doing now, he would go, no way. I mean,
yeah.
How the hell could you do that? Right. I want to shift gears too, to just keep this as useful for all the folks who are listening to us, because you have a really interesting formula for success that I want you to chat a bit about. The first part of it is, Scott Adams, the now disgraced, I guess, cartoonist.
Right.
He had a really, nevertheless, great idea about building a talent stack, right?
Mm-hmm.
In other words, you don't have to be top percentile on one thing. It's much better to be, like, really good at several.
A bunch of stuff.
Yeah, which you agree with, and then, but the other part that he doesn't, he kind of goes into, but he just does it to show like all the ways that people interpret things differently. Another one that you insist upon, which I want you to expand on, is you got to be able to communicate clearly. And so that's one of those interesting things. It's really interesting to say, hey, you got to be able to make yourself clear. Okay, good advice.
Right,
But
right.
how the hell do you do that? And you're particularly good at that. So is there any, like, I don't know, process, something that somebody could, listening to this, use as a jumping off point?
I guess the feedback loop that I've had working on visualized value has been one of them, but one tangible or practical thing that I've found helpful when we've developed curriculums before, I've had somebody who has no idea what this stuff is go through the entirety of the curriculum and say, the context is different. Like if you're building somebody up from zero knowledge on a subject and trying to get them to basically stack these concepts on top of one another until you understand it, that has been really helpful for me to like understand where I missed something. And I think I got that in the agency world too, where you're telling a story sequentially, slide by slide by slide, and you obviously have to have a good enough. This is another problem I think with agency world is sometimes there's not enough conflict, or there's not enough pushback, or there's not enough like, people don't want to step on toes, and the idea of getting great feedback, I just attribute so much of my growth professionally to a couple of people in my career that have genuinely told me that's not good enough. Like they'll say, at my first boss, told this story a few times on podcasts now, but the guy that I was telling you about worked at JWT, and we do these like reviews of work in the office. It's like, bring me the work at this time, right? And I would come over and I'm walking out, and we're in like a 300 square foot studio. I'm like, like all these caveats before I present it. I'm like, it's not really good enough. It's not really ready. And he's like, why are you bringing it to me then? Like, go and sit back down and tell me you need more time. Don't waste my time bringing me stuff that isn't good enough. Like, if it's not good enough, what do you think I'm going to say about it? Like, I'm not here to like make you feel better about that stuff. I want you to get better at what you're doing. And if you don't feel like you've taken it as far as you can take it, go and sit back down and do it. And I had a few like really direct, funnily enough, German, European creative director bosses in my early agency days that were like so incredibly direct about what they thought that, I'm so grateful for that. And that's another, like, putting yourself in uncomfortable, quote unquote, situations where you might not be the best. And huge props to anybody in a professional environment that is empathetic enough to do that. I've heard somebody refer to that as macro empathy. So the idea of, if you really care about somebody, if you really want them to get better and feel more confident, you will tell them that what they're bringing to you isn't good enough or needs work or whatever else. Like, the discomfort you feel in the short term is a massive favor that you're doing over the long term. So a lot of it has to do with that. And I think just be like, maybe this comes across as a bad advice, but it's like, be harder on yourself sometimes. Like, as you meant, like the reality tunnel thing, I think is a good frame for this, where it's like, this might make sense to you, but you're operating from a completely different set of references. Not completely different set, but you have like cumulatively a different understanding of the world than somebody else, right? Even if like one word might have, like, you might have a better grasp of the definition of a complicated word, for example, than somebody else. And this all depends on what you're trying to accomplish. But if your goal is to make knowledge accessible, which mine has been for a few years, the idea of making things more complicated for the sake of, chasing a more sophisticated reader is completely in the antithesis of my goal. I'm not saying nobody should use complicated language, or if that's what you're trying to do, you should absolutely do it. But the imperative to make your ideas as accessible as possible, if that's the thing you're trying to build, it does come down to empathy. I think it's like understanding. My wife Celia has been a massive help to me in the last few years, where I will sometimes get on the like stubborn creative, like, I'm not dumbing this down, I'm not gonna explain why I did this and this. She's like, that's what people want to hear. Like, that's why people are listening to you in the first place. Like, you made a name off of simplifying complex ideas, and now you're in this, I get stuck sometimes in these like, I'm not gonna go back to simple. And it's like you're completely working against the thing that, resonated in the first place. So having people to check you is a lot of it. Don't believe your own bullshit. That's another good one. And just, repetition of getting into rooms or writing things on the internet, trying to explain things that you've learned. And I wrote this tweet a couple of years ago. It's like, there's always opportunity in simplifying something. Like, there is always something out there that a large number of people do not understand that would be useful. So like communication as a skill, there's always, excuse using like a cold term, but there's always like an arbitrage opportunity there, right? Take this complicated thing, simplify it, and introduce people that would not have been able to access it through that lens. And you're like straddling these two spots where you might understand something that you have an opportunity to simplify because you've spent more time around it. And that just unlocks a lot of opportunity, but it's also like a really good feeling to be able to take something that somebody didn't understand. Like, I still get emails now about like one graphic I posted 2 years ago or 3 years ago, and someone's like, this changed the way I thought about X forever. And like, you can't even quantify the benefit of that. It's very powerful.
Yeah. And as you were speaking, I was thinking about Chuck Mingus, the jazz musician. His son was a oil painter, and his son presented some work to him that was abstract, kind of expressionist. And Mingus was really hard on him, and he said, "You know what? Go and learn how to paint an apple that looks like an apple, and after you've done that, then come back to me with the stuff."
Yeah.
Because, and I always love that line because it's really harsh, but there is so much truth in it, right? Like the people like Picasso, horrible human being, great artist.
Yeah.
But like Trump uses the bull example about him. First off, in his early work, man, did that guy know how to paint a bull that looked like a bull. But then his genius was in abstracting it to just the line, right? That Steve Jobs ended up using in an Apple commercial. And so I see that in your work as well. And, as far as it sounds like we've had similar experiences, because my wife saved me too. One of the first things that I ever wrote, I wrote for Barron's when I was 32. And it was on a particular investment strategy. And my wife graduated summa cum laude in journalism and was gracious enough to be willing to look at my work. And the first time I asked her to do that was for that article. And, I had been the editor of my school newspaper in high school and worked on the college newspapers and everything. And I thought I was a pretty good writer. And like literally, she looked at what I wrote that I was going to submit to Barron's. We were on a train going into New York City. And she looked at me and she said, "This is the worst piece of shit I've ever seen in my life."
Respect.
And I got really angry, right? Like,
You do to begin with, man.
oh
Yeah.
man, I was lit up. I was so mad. Like, and the night didn't go well.
Right.
But then the next morning I woke up and like in a huff, like, so what's wrong with it? And she's like, everything. You're using these $10 words when a 5-cent word is gonna
Mhm.
make your point a lot better. She goes, and so here, and she had redlined the whole thing. And she
Wow.
handed it to me. And I looked at it again, got angry. But then as I reworked it, I realized, oh my God, she is so right.
Yeah.
And that kind of feeds back into what we were talking about earlier, right? We, I, as I've gone through life, I've come to realize that the average human, the fragility of the average human, myself included,
Oh, of course. Yeah.
is much more profound than I thought when I was a young guy. Let's put it that way.
Mhm.
And so like, I don't know that there's a hack. I don't know that there's a hack that you can learn like you had with your wife reminding you. I had with my wife telling me that what I had done was just absolute bullshit. Like how writing on the internet would be one way. Any other ideas like for how people could like jump off into the willingness to like be told like you're
Yeah. I think as you were explaining that, the language that came to my mind is like you have to get closer to reality.
yes.
And your wife, for the most part, is gonna be as close to somebody telling you that you're high on your own supply as anybody, right?
Right.
And that's true in the market sense too. Like in the agency sense, you are so many layers abstracted away from the market, right? Like you're kind of shielded from. I think this is another Navalism, maybe Balaji. I don't know. It's like everyone's boss is the CEO is everyone's boss, and the boss's boss is the market, and like that mentality, I think it's really, really, I guess, paradoxical, because what I'm saying in the context of not having reality as your boss, it's really hard to get that feedback. Like if you have a great boss like I had when I started, they will tell you what they think and you'll get better really, really quickly. If you're in an environment that doesn't optimize for like real feedback, you're stuck in this stagnant thing. But luckily you have access to the internet and you can write. Like Twitter, in my mind, is reality. Like you're getting, for the most part, feedback on buttons you're pressing, not necessarily on the truth of your statement, but the resonance of the thing you're saying is being tested in real time. And now even like the idea of literally monetizing the amount of eyeballs natively through Twitter is just an evolution of that, right? YouTube, Twitter, all of these things are, and it is really an uphill battle, I think, if you have if you are trying to do something countercultural in many ways. Like if you're in education, let's say, the platforms available to you, for the most part, do not optimize for quote unquote educational content. I imagine a lot of the people listening to this are lean in that direction. I don't think there's that many TikTokers listening to our conversation here, thinking about, how to make investment thesis more accessible. For example, just like you're fighting against these incentives, but being on the platforms that give you like instant feedback from reality, in my mind, is a huge accelerant of the learning loop. It's really comes back to, I think we said this at the beginning of the conversation. It's like it all comes from putting yourself in a situation where you can potentially fail or be uncomfortable or feel some kind of downside. Because by trying to protect your downside, you are obviously giving up any potential upside. And there are risks to anything, obviously, but of the, writing blog posts on the internet, for example, people call that like, is asymmetric upside to that, right? You're becoming a better writer. Like, take the Morgan Housels of the world is probably a good reference for this podcast. Like, incredible writer that just kept going and going and going and going. Talent is obviously recognized, published an incredible book. Yeah, another book about to be published, grow an amazing personal network. And I think that, I don't know, that feedback loop seems more real to me than trying to do that in a environment where incentives don't necessarily line up with what the person consuming the work wants. I think eventually they do, but when you're trying to grow and you're trying to learn quickly, those environments definitely slow you down. Like do you have 20 years of experience or 1 year experience 20 times over? You heard that one before?
Yeah.
That to me feels like that doesn't happen on the internet. Like, every day on the internet is vastly and wildly different, for better or worse. It's like the variance machine that you're talking about. I think that is the unlock, especially if access to those environments physically is difficult, which for most people it is.
Yeah. I love your idea that the unlock is being able to get closer to reality. And another one of my favorite authors is who I call the fictional character known as Jed McKenna, who is an Enlightenment author. And he's got this great quote, which is, if you're having a little tea party with Lord Lion and Lady Gazelle, and somebody comes along who doesn't buy your fantasy narrative, it isn't that they're mean. It's maybe that your little fantasy narrative is just a bit too fragile.
Right.
And somebody coming along in this is the internet, right? In your example. And that was one of the things that I learned at a very young age because of what I was doing. The market, man, I'll tell you, if your job is asset management in the market, buying and selling stocks, reality pounds you in the face every day.
Yeah.
and you can say, "Oh, I'm right and the market's wrong." You're not going to do well if you're going to try to maintain that.
Yeah.
You're wrong. The market's right. And if you take that the right way, it becomes this really powerful unlock. Because the other thing, I'm always trying to build algorithms. That's from being a quant for so long.
Mm-hmm.
But who are some of the best people to hire? Former special forces. They're amazing because their closeness to reality and the feedback,
unmatched,
life and death, right?
Yeah.
And so these are people who very quickly pivot, change, whatever, and are very agile. Emergency doctors, another people who are really interesting because they again, life and death. I got to make a decision now. What's the reality of this particular situation? And so those kinds of backgrounds are very useful in a variety of endeavors, not just, their original domain.
Mm-hmm.
And so I completely agree on that particular item. Well, listen, this has been I could talk to you forever. I love your stuff. I love what you're doing. I do have to ask, I wasn't going to do it, but because I always try to be anti-mimetic and I don't want to talk what everyone else is talking about, but I loved your redesign for Musk's folly. By the way, I'm not sure it's folly, which puts me in the minority.
Yeah.
I actually think it might be fucking genius. And I loved your redesign. What do you think? What do you think about him changing this long-standing logo of the bird, which I learned yesterday, by the way, was a 3-person job. And
I saw that thread. Yeah.
Yeah, right. And so I was fascinated by that. But what do you think? What do you think of the X and what he's doing there?
I almost referenced the Buffett slide. Never bet against Elon Musk. I mean, the guy, to imagine that there is not a massive amount of long-term thinking behind that move is, in my mind, a naive position to take, that this guy is not thinking in decades. And I think there's probably some vanity play in there, right? You want the thing that you are spending a ton of your time on to be reflective of your idea, or leave your mark on the thing. And then on the logo front, I think that's a Unicode. I think that's just a standard character from the Unicode alphabet. Incredible. Yeah. The suggestion that I made was kind of this like snarky idea of keeping some of the visual equity of Twitter. So using the scallop of the check mark, which obviously there's been a ton of controversy around over the last year or however long this thing has been going on now. Feels like a year, maybe it hasn't been that long. And flipping that on its head with the X, like this idea also of the contrast between those two symbols, the X and the check mark, which in my mind embodies this, the pursuit of truth, the, independently verifiable experience of the world, all the things that he has been very vocal about, his ambition of what Twitter should mean and do. There's a huge aspiration to integrate payments into this thing, right? And that was like a huge story arc of his career, is the PayPal days, like bringing that full circle, which feels like, there's some personal motivation in there for sure, but I think that's also, it's all very obvious why a decision like that would be made. And you get like a ton of you guys are throwing this many years of equity out of the window and stuff, but I don't know, I think people don't give human beings enough credit a lot of the time. It's like, you think people are going to forget that Twitter went to X? Like, do you think anybody's going to like not remember that was the transition? No, like everybody, like I imagine the daily active users on Twitter since this has begun just continues to go up and up and up and up and up. So I think that, like, from a brand perspective, I think losing the verb to tweet, that's going to be, I'm very, very curious to understand what our new vernacular for that will be. And it will maybe emerge from the crowd, but I'm such a huge fan of this idea of tapping the hive mind for the identity of it too, which I just like, that just aligns with everything that I'm about. And it was so fun to contribute to that. Like, I had to basically drop my entire day yesterday when I saw that tweet. I'm like, I have to work on this. So I did 3 versions of it. But yeah, it's man, there's never a dull day on there. It's going to be really interesting to watch it roll out.
I totally agree. And for what it's worth, I did tweet, hey, Elon, I think we found your designer.
I appreciate that. Yeah.
Because I thought your blending of the old with the new, but also with the impact of it, right? Like flipping it on its head was really brilliant. But I also love the idea of the hive mind. I've always loved that idea. And I, way back when, 5 or 6 years ago, I decided that I was going all in on online about 2016. I stopped doing traditional media for the most part, just because I saw what I think has been unfolding and will continue to unfold, which is the world is moving, and it's already moved, frankly. And that's why I'm amused by all the people saying, that's not going to work. Well,
right. It's very much the midwit meme in practice, right? It's like
really is
X.com, easy to like, is the best domain in the world, basically. You know, one letter domain for something of that
Totally.
magnitude is incredible. And then in the middle, it's like, oh, the brand equity is being destroyed. The reality is like even I've talked about this with Trung and Bilal on our other podcasts a lot. And it feels like Twitter is such a hard business to value in real time. Like it really does feel like I've been looked at very funny for saying that like $44 billion for that platform is like the biggest bargain ever. Like this idea of the real time mapping of sentiment, consciousness, even being able to report things from every corner of the earth. It's like there's no replacement for it. There's nothing that has that level of network effect. There's nothing that heads of state announce things on as readily as Twitter or any, I learned this when I started Visualize Value, that it's so different from like the Facebook fan page, for example, where the person who it's about does not engage with the thing. On Twitter, these people are opening the app and checking their notifications natively. It felt like such a massive, just a huge unlock in my life, figuring that out. I was like, wow, all these people who are doing things that I really, really want to be involved in are literally one sentence and a button click away from reading what I want to say to them. And then the entire challenge becomes, what do I say? It's not an access problem. It's like a articulation problem, which is up until 10 years ago, the entire thing was flipped on its head. That's like banging on doors and knowing this person and getting an introduction via that. And that stuff is still true to some degree, but when you say like best time to be alive for just like creating access to things that you otherwise like would have to live 100 lifetimes to get the chance to bump into somebody is a really, really fascinating thing. And it's so unnatural, and you have to really lean into it. And I think COVID for me was that it normalized a lot of that stuff, or it shifted us into the internet first, fully digital relationships and completely decentralized businesses. Even just like people I work with are thousands and thousands of miles apart, different time zones, all of that.
Same with me. And it gave birth to the series that I need to get back to. We've been doing a bunch of other stuff, but we call it The Great Reshuffle. And COVID definitely sped up a lot of things that I thought were coming, right? But I think that the lockdown made them happen 7-10 years earlier than they might have.
Mm-hmm.
And some of them are really good things, I think. For my thesis had always been Twitter is going to become the worldwide global intelligence network that is always on. And when you think about that for a minute, you have everybody has access to that, right? And so like the what you were just saying really resonates with me so strongly, because like we have access to whoever we want, really, and like your abilities just sync up so perfectly, because to get that shot right, you've got to be able to have like it really owned, because otherwise you're right, you are just screaming into the void. But that's the other thing. I just think so many people like do Twitter wrong. And I don't think that it's like a function of what generation you're a member of. I think that it contributes, right? But Zoomers are digital natives. And I certainly am not. But I think that you're doing it right. And that's why I love to be able to chat with you and have others hear the way you're looking at things. Well, this has been a wonderful conversation. At the end of this podcast, we did it to you last time. We're going to do it to you again. So you get to do 2 more incepts. We're
Okay.
going to make you emperor of the world for one day. As you know, you can't kill anyone. You can't put them in re-education camps, but you can take a magical microphone and speak 2 things into it, and you are going to incept the entire 8 billion population of the world. Whenever they wake up, whenever their tomorrow is, they're going to wake up and think, I've just had 2 of the greatest insights, and I'm going to take action against them right now. What are you going to incept in the world's population?
2. You said I got 2?
2.
Okay. The first one, I'm going to quote something that I heard a couple of days ago. I was listening to an Alan Watts lecture. You can't have more yin than yang. That's the first one I'm going to go for.
I love that. I love Alan Watts too.
Incredible, incredibly articulate guy, yeah. And then the second one, I would say, it would definitely have to do with this concept of stop waiting for permission. And that's like, there's so much nuance to it. So I'm trying to distill it into a single statement, but it's like, you have agency to create something that best represents what you care about. And that thing will completely change the way you interact with the world. You have to start creating it, putting it out there, and it's going to be an iterative process.
I love it. The quote that I'm familiar with is, "It's far better to ask for forgiveness than permission."
Mm-hmm.
And I've had to ask for forgiveness quite a bit in my life.
I imagine, yeah.
And I suspect you too.
Indeed.
Well, listen, Jack, this has been a wonderful time. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you. I appreciate it.